Good morning, all.
Morning.
I'm Carolyn, and I want to welcome all of you to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Rappahannock. It's great to see so many old friends. We're a fellowship that enthusiastically welcomes and embraces all equally. We are committed to providing a safe haven in difficult times and to exploring the challenges we face as a society and taking action to address those challenges. We make common cause with all who want to make the world a better, fairer, healthier, and happier place. We honor each other and our planet and recognize that spirituality that is most meaningful requires that we put our beliefs into action. We're very grateful to our outstanding members that assist us to do the work necessary to sustain and grow our fellowship and make a real difference in our community and in the world. We're delighted today to hear from Edward Correia, my husband, and he will talk to us about the past and the future, intellectual changes in the 19th century. Announcements are in the bulletin. A special welcome to first-time visitors. I think I see one. Please stay for refreshments after the service and take part in the continuing conversation. At this time, please be sure your cell phones are silenced. As we gathered this morning for fellowship, we light our chalice. May its light be a beacon of hope for many, for those who feel lost, those who feel threat, those who feel tired, those who feel uncertain. May our beacon of hope help you find home, help you feel safe, give you respite, and honor your searching mind and spirit. This morning's opening words come from Arlen Goff. Thresholds. We cross them every day, from room to room, from outside to inside, and back again, from here to there, from anywhere to everywhere, from age to age. Each threshold offers an opportunity for change, for renewal, for transformation, from where we were and what we are to where we can be. In this hour and in this place, we cross a threshold from our day-to-day everydayness into space and time attuned to the other, to the sacred, to the holy, into an awareness of new life, pregnant with new possibilities. How will we be renewed in this moment? How will we be changed by this hour? How will we be transformed through this gathering of beloved community? This morning is Eddie Correia. Eddie is a longtime member of the fellowship, and when he's not here, he's an attorney in Washington, D.C., and also a law school professor. And we are going to hear from Eddie this morning about dinosaur fossils, Darwin, and the end of the fairy tale. Eddie?
Thanks, Carol. Well, I'm going to talk about the 19th century in large part today. So this is a reading from a book about that period by Edward Dolnick, Dinosaurs at the Dinner Table. In the early decades of the 1800s, the world was a safe and cozy place. The natural world, that is the living world of trees and flowers and darting fish and soaring birds and leaping deer. It is a happy world wrote William Paley in 1802, one of the era's most influential books. The air, the earth, the water teem with delighted existence. Everywhere he turned his gaze, Paley went on, myriads of happy beings crowd upon my view. Paley was a deeply knowledgeable student of natural history, not a daydreaming, wandering barefoot through the woods. He was both a philosopher and a clergyman. And in England in the years around 1800, few thinkers were as well known or well regarded. The more closely you looked at nature, Paley argued, the more proof you found that the whole system had been flawlessly designed. It was true on the largest scale. The whale's mighty heart was a feat of oversized engineering. A child could crawl through a whale's aorta. And on the smallest scale, the human eye and ear made use of muscles so tiny they were miracles in miniature. And yet, Paley marveled, the grandest and most precious of our faculties, sight and hearing, depend on their health and action. Every creature was an ingenious living machine, and all those creatures interacted in perfect and eternal balance. God's wisdom and foresight shone out everywhere you looked. Consider which animals were rare and which were common. Birds of prey seldom produced more than 2 eggs, Paley noted approvingly, so that the skies weren't thick with dive-bombing raiders. Harmless sparrows or ducks, on the other hand, might have a dozen eggs in the nest. In the sea, we find 1,000,000 herrings for a single shark. How would such a smooth-running complexity come to be? Not by chance. To look at the world as it hummed along was to marvel at the God who had designed it all. Better yet, the creator was as kind as he was wise. The happiness that we see all around us was not a fortunate surprise. It was the point of the whole operation. The world was made with a benevolent design, Paley declared. The humblest creatures displayed their glee as unmistakably as 5th graders bursting out of school at the end of the day. Even newborn flies flitting about with their gratuitous activity, their continual change of place without any use or purpose, testify their joy and exultation. Fish are so happy that they know not what to do with themselves. I want to talk about the 19th century in the beginning, and then I want to talk about what that means for us now. There were drastic changes during that century in our understanding of the world. It suggests that the same thing can happen to us over the next century. Now, these changes are limited to a certain sector of society who trust science, and that's not everyone. There are some people who reject science. That leads to a radical conflict in some ways, and I think we're feeling that now. Let me start out with a basic timeline. You may remember this from high school. The universe is about 13.8 billion years old. The Milky Way, our galaxy, 13.6 billion. Now, that's pretty quickly after the Big Bang. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Now, think about the timeline difference between the Milky Way and the Earth. That's a vast amount of time for other galaxies to develop and other planets to develop. The first organisms on Earth were very simple organisms. They probably resembled green slime on a rock, something like that, 4.3 billion years. Notice how quickly that occurred after the Earth was formed, 4.5 billion to 4.3 billion. Now, one thing that means is that in that vast amount of time between the formation of our galaxy and the formation of Earth and the very short time it took to life to develop, think how many planets could have life around the universe that are much more advanced than we are, perhaps billions of years. If those species are still haven't gone extinct, they could be vastly advanced from us technologically. Dinosaurs probably emerged about 240 million years ago and became extinct about 66 million years ago. That's a run of about 165, 170 million years. If humans last a tenth of that long, we will be around to know it, but that will be surprising. The dinosaurs had a very good run. First mammals were about 225 million years ago, and then humans around 200,000 years ago. Writing about 5,000 years ago. Science, if you date it with Copernicus or Isaac Newton's Principia, about 300, 350 years. So we've really only had 350 years of real science. Think about planets that have been around for 100 million years or a billion years. We will never see them because they're too far away. We may hear from them through electromagnetic signals that travel at the speed of light. Let's go back to the beginning of the 19th century. There was a very firm belief, even among scientists, about intelligent design, as that reading suggests. The idea was the entire universe was made perfectly by an omnipotent and omniscient God. And it was all designed primarily to benefit humans, the ultimate creation of that God. The mountains where minerals were deposited, all designed by God to make life better for humans. The earth rotated at just the right speed so that the breeze was not too strong and was pleasant. Water comes down as rain rather than in torrents. The night rolls around every 24 hours because that's when we get tired, every 24 hours. Now, that may seem fanciful to us, but it was widely held view. Isaac Newton, maybe the greatest scientist in history, who discovered gravity, among other things, read his Bible every day and was convinced that the universe was like a giant clock, amazing clock that worked in perfect order. Nobody considered the idea of evolution. To the extent animals may have changed over time, the idea was God must have improved them. There was no concept of extinction of species. Now, people still had to close their eyes to invent explanations for all the suffering in the world and the evil in the world. And the church had to explain that, typically explaining it that it's just too mysterious to understand and maybe even wrong to inquire and try to understand it. It's all part of God's plan. Now, why did that unravel? Well, at the beginning of the 19th century, we began to discover fossils. It's not as if fossils were not there all the time. It's that when people uncovered them, they didn't know what they were. They ground them up. They used them for building materials. There was just no sense of the science that was to come in the 19th century. But things began to change. One of the reasons for the development was in the UK. There was a great interest in geology. Geology was fascinating to a lot of people, much more so than it is today. There was a boom in digging and construction, so you're going to find more fossils. We might begin the transition with it, not in the UK, but in New Hampshire on a farm, a 12-year-old boy discovered some dinosaur footprints that were just so huge it couldn't be explained by any other animal. And then as fossils began to be uncovered, they were bones that were so huge they just did not fit any pattern. Scientists argued what they were, again, a great resistance to the idea of extinction. One theory was these were giants, human giants that had lived in the past but were no longer around. There was a sort of bragging rights on the part of scientists in the UK that their fossils were the biggest. So the UK must have been able to support something that was huge and impressive. Thomas Jefferson, who considered himself a scientist as well as a political leader, found bones, or bones were reported to him, and he felt like he should stand up for the United States, that we also had used fossils. It turned out he'd found the bones of a giant sloth, but he still bragged about it for a while. Now, science eventually unraveled that. And one lesson, I think, from that is that's the way science works. It just grinds ahead. It crushes everything in its path eventually, because there's just too much evidence for scientific truth. So toward the middle of the 19th century, along came Darwin, the Origin of Species in 1859. Now, Darwin had an incredible insight. It sounds like common sense. It is common sense, but no one had ever thought about it. No one ever studied it so carefully. The idea of natural selection. Darwin, as everyone knows, went to the Galapagos and looked at different islands and saw beaks with different finches with different shaped beaks on different islands. Why did they have different shaped beaks? Because the food source on a particular island fit that particular beak. They were either fruit and seeds or insects, whatever. Those beaks were seemingly adapted to whatever the food stuff was on these various islands. Darwin's insight was that if a bird has a particular beak, it's going to be more successful in an environment where that beak works. And finches with different sized beaks are not going to be as successful. And eventually, the birds with the most adaptive, most successful beaks will predominate. Maybe the other type of bird will become extinct. Common sense, yes, but he had the brilliance to have the insight. Now, Darwin didn't really know enough to understand why those beaks were changing. He can understand natural selection, but why did you have a certain kind of beak in the first place? DNA was really not discovered until later in the 19th century. People didn't understand what it was. Our familiar model of the DNA molecule wasn't discovered until 1954. Gregor Mendel, remember, you may have read about him in high school, who did work on genetics of peas, and the beginning of understanding that certain genes come from one parent and other genes come from another parent. But his work, which was published in 1866, I think, nobody paid attention to it till the 20th century. And no one really understands, certainly not Darwin, the idea of a mutation, that the way changes come is through a random mutation. And the species, the animals that happen to be the lucky ones to inherit that successful mutation are the ones that begin to dominate. Now, that is what evolution is. It's very hard to come to terms with it. It's such a, first of all, it's incremental, but we've been around 4.5 billion years, so we've had time for this to happen. To think that through a random process, notes there's no role for a creator in this story. This is just random accidents of genetic mutations. You may have heard about it's easier to understand this, the peppered moth example in the UK. Two kinds of pepper moths, one darker and one lighter. But as the Industrial Revolution developed and England's environment became sootier and darker, the darker moths became more predominant because they were more successful to avoid predators. So that explains natural selection as Darwin understood it. Still doesn't tell you how you had two moths to begin with, but that has to do with the random mutation. Now, that idea that we are where we are what we are like, and the universe has moved along in this very slow incremental pace over billions of years. That could happen without a divine force and divine planning. Very hard to wrap your mind around that. And it's reflected in polls today. That's what I'm telling you is the consensus science position. But a poll, 2004, 60% of Americans say humans and other living things have evolved over time. So that's most people. However, of those who accept the idea of evolution, about half of that says it's driven by a natural process. The other half say God is controlling it. Now, that's the Catholic Church position. If you look in the Catholic Catechism, I think Pope John 23rd may have said that the Catholic Church accepts evolution. Remember, the Catholic Church had the terrible reputation of rejecting scientific advances and rejecting the idea of the Copernican solar system, that the planets revolve around the sun. Still stung to this day, probably, that they look so foolish for that. So they're anxious to accept science, but still not accept the idea that evolution is a completely natural process. Why would God do that? Why would God oversee evolution over billions of years? Differences by country. The United States, of those who think, and by the way, 24% say God created the world as it is right now. Forget about evolution. All those creatures were created by God as they exist today. In the United States still has the highest percentage of modern nations saying God controlled evolution. 24%. The rest of the world close to us, Argentina, 18%, Australia, 14%, Germany, 7%, and Spain, 6%. Now, that difference of how we view the world, I think, it may not be a problem. I want to talk about why it may be a problem, but just hold your mind in your mind the idea of the differences about the view about evolution and how we got to where we are. Because the next big development is likely to be a scientific understanding of the origin of the universe. Today, very high percentage of people believe that God or some divine force was responsible for the Big Bang. There is a majority of support for the idea of the Big Bang. You remember that you learned in high school that as conventionally explained, the matter in the universe was compressed to a point. I've never thought that was very persuasive, but it's often described that way, but certainly compressed to amazing infinite density. The energy level became so great that there was an explosion of energy, not into dark, empty space. It's not as if the universe was some big empty void. There was no space either. So as the Big Bang occurred and progressed, space was created too. That is the conventional model of the Big Bang. Scientists usually stop right there and don't inquire further or say it's meaningless to ask, why was there a Big Bang in the first place? But I think that's what we're going to discover, maybe not in the next decade or the next 2 decades, but over the next century. There will be credible theories and eventually overwhelming proof about how the Big Bang occurred without the role of a divine creator. Moreover, if it was a purely natural event, spontaneously occurring, it's not going to happen just one time. It's not a one-time thing. That means there are probably other universes. We live in a multiverse. Now, how are we going to understand each other and how are we going to be able to talk to each other if people have such radically different views of the world? Because there will be people, as there are today, who reject that theory of the origin of the universe, just as they reject evolution. Now, my own view is that as long as we are tolerant of each other and respect each other's point of view, that's not going to be a huge problem. I think the problem occurs, consider our fellowship. We have different views about higher power, maybe a God of some sort, and others disagree with that. That does not create a problem for us because we respect each other's point of view and we're able to talk to each other and we share most of our values. But if you look around the world, and even in this country, that's not true across the board. I think the Islamic world is particularly a difficult situation because, as we saw with our speaker the other day, the way Islam has developed is a belief that the Quran was divinely, not just divinely inspired, divinely written, dictated by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad word for word. And if that is your view, unless you fundamentally change the theology of Islam, you're really not open to ideas that the Quran is wrong in some respects or mistaken in some respects, or that it was maybe true at one time and not true at another time. That story means it's true for all time, and every word of it is true for all time. That makes communication and understanding difficult. Even in this country, I think there is a group of people, they're probably the same people who say God created all the species at the same time, several thousand years ago, who believe very differently, have a very different conception of the world. And again, I don't think that is necessarily a problem unless one group begins to say and believe that their truth is the truth for everybody. Because at that point, communication breaks down and discussion tends to break down and compromise tends to break down. So I don't think there's an easy solution to that. I think that we just have to continue talking to each other and have respect for each other's beliefs. And also, let me conclude this way. I think we need to distinguish between scientific truth and spiritual truth. Because scientific truth is something that cannot be in the eyes of the beholder. It's not really a subjective matter. It's a matter of what the evidence shows. And scientists may disagree for a while. But eventually, as science grinds on in the way it tends to grind on, there will be overwhelming proof for one theory or another. So as to that, I think one can hope that the world and more of the world will come to accept scientific truth. But spiritual truth is a very different thing. And as to spiritual truth, I think the challenge is that we respect each other's views and that we do not take the position that my truth is your truth. And if we do that, I think the world will be able to continue to function. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Eddie. As always, you've given us a lot to think about. And now I'm going to invite people to ask questions or make comments. I ask that you wait till I come with a microphone because we are also showing this on Zoom and people at home won't be able to hear you. And also that you answer the questions from the lectern. Got the rules?
This reminds me of home somehow.
I think the confusion comes from people trying to pinpoint what science says and what spirituality says. And so, being humans, we always think, okay, well, God created us in his image, and so that's what it is. But when you look outside of what is physical matter, that doesn't exist, and that's all science is doing, is looking at what's physical. You don't see what's non-physical. And, there's many theories that, God isn't controlling everything. It put its essence into something, and that essence grows into purity. And physical aspects change it from what it is and alters it. But when you try to say, well, we can't measure God, that's because it's not physical. And when you're saying, well, he's a controller and he can, it's a he or whatever it is, you're just putting your own aspect on it.
Yeah. No, I think it's right. A lot of this the difficulty turns on the conception of God. A conception of God that's anthropomorphic, as is suggested by the use of the term he, and the idea that God intervenes in the world and helps some people and doesn't help other people and chooses some people and doesn't like other people and all that, that's where the trouble comes. But when you have different conceptions of God, I just don't think lend themselves to quite that problem. They don't lend themselves to the problem of my truth is your truth. And I have my own conception of God. I talked the other day about whether we should continue to use that term because I think it's very useful. One of the most reasons it's useful is it helps the conversation, it helps the dialogue. And because you end up discussing with other people about their conception of God. If you say there is no God, it tends to be a conversation stopper in a way. But it's that anthropomorphic version. But I completely agree with the idea that God as a more spiritual notion is not only there's very powerful argument for something like that, it doesn't tend to divide us. Which is
Thank you, Eddie. That was a great talk. And I love the way you got from your basic topic to where we are today, which I guess is the timeline that we're so much concerned about right now. I was sort of thinking, although Jeff got my wheels turning more, about the lady that stopped at our protest yesterday and rolled down her window and explained to all of us people holding our signs that said things like, save the rule of law, that we were aiding and abetting sex traffickers. Sort of like,
yeah.
which brings me to the way that we spread information, where I was standing next to a man who said that he voted for Trump the last time, and but he watched Fox News. He listened to Fox News. He was a long distance truck driver, and it was entertaining. But he believed the things on there, and he doesn't anymore. So that part was good. But this whole idea of how we spread information and the evolution of technology and the way that greater technology allows ideas to evolve faster is pretty terrifying. I'm just almost finished reading Careless People. I don't know if anyone else has read it. It's the book by Sarah Wynne Williams about Facebook. She was a disgruntled Facebook employee, and it's really fascinating how oblivious a lot of the people were to the side effects of growing such a huge business.
Yeah.
Anyway, but thanks for the differing perspectives. It's really interesting how we can keep in dialogue as we feel different things and we think different things.
Yeah, that's why, although it's not a bright line between scientific truth and spiritual truth. There was a line there somewhere. I'd be hard pressed to tell you exactly what it is. But I think when we're on the scientific truth side of the line, we have to have confidence there is some objective reality to that. If we lose the idea there's an objective statement about scientific truth, then we're in the world of complete subjectivity, and someone's RFK science is just as good as real science just views. That's a big problem. We have a problem now, obviously, with an administration, a president who, and maybe many in Congress, I hope not on the Supreme Court, there's a certain religious viewpoint that they think is objectively correct. Objectively correct, not just for them, that's a subjective idea, but objectively correct for everybody else. That is the danger, I think, right now, the sort of the modern danger of this problem.
What interests me most about evolution is the fact that two different creatures can develop the same facility, like bats and birds are very, very different. They sprung from two different
Lines of evolution.
yeah. And yet they fly. Their wings are somewhat different, but they're assembled, pretty much assembled in the same way.
Yeah.
And that itself is I think would be a problem for some people, but it's very interesting to me.
It is fascinating. That's called convergent evolution. The idea you could start out with different ancestors with different genetic tracks. And the logic of natural selection is that millions of years later will produce wings that are very similar, even though the genetic track is very, very different. One thing I take some comfort in, I don't know if you get any comfort out of this, but that's true at a universal level too. So that extraterrestrials who are evolving on other planets, maybe in other universes, the same logic's going to apply there too. And therefore, they're not going to look like us, but they may have similar characteristics because the logic of natural selection is the same there as it is here.
First, I want to off the topic here. I want to explain my pajamas this morning. It's May the 4th, so May the 4th be with you. When I think of God, I think of the force, the force that is controlling everything, and maybe not controlling everything, just the force that goes from being forceful in a positive direction that we would consider to be positive, or to the opposite, the force that would be negative and destructive. And I think about vibration and waves, and Tesla said everything is vibration. And when you think about a vibration, it's got a high point and a low point. It's got a contraction where everything is getting small, like the Big Bang, compression, and an expansion where everything is getting wider and bigger and exploding. And it happens over and over again. There's this compression and expansion. And when you think about the Big Bang coming out of nothing, this white space or no space, and creating all of this, the universe and galaxies and planets, and they say that it's expanding faster now than it used to, is what I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So that makes no sense in relation to the science that we understand, because if you drop a pebble in a pond that's completely still and you see those ripples come out, as the ripples go away from the pebble where the pebble was dropped, slowly they get slower and slower and wider until they are gone. This idea is that after the Big Bang, the waves were wider and wider, and now they're getting smaller and faster. So that goes in, flies in the face of the science that we know. So there's so much going on that we know is going on that flies in the face of what our rules for science are. So I have to keep an open mind about that. And I think about what could have caused that Big Bang. If you think about a torus is a shape that is like a donut. And an energy pattern of a torus starts in the center of the donut, and it goes up and over or down and under and out to the edges and then back to center again. And it's like this circular pattern, but it's in a donut shape going around. If we're going away from that Big Bang, perhaps there's a point where we start going under the edge of the torus and back towards the center again, faster and faster. And if all of these galaxies and everything meet each other in the center of that torus, that could cause that compression. And then we would have the Big Bang and then the Gnab Gnib, which is the opposite, right? And then the Big Bang again and the Gnab Gnib, and it's this rotating energy and compression, and it's just a thought that came to me. But
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Just two things to comment on. One, your idea that something violates scientific rules. It may seem to violate established scientific rules. That means you got to change the rules. And that's what happens periodically. That's Einstein changed the rules about how you think of time. And to speak of Einstein, he also had a big problem with this expansion of the universe and just did not see how that would work because gravity would seem to be a force that would bring everything together. He just didn't understand how the universe continued to expand. That led him to what he later says was the biggest blunder of his life, to invent a cosmological constant to keep everything in place. But there is a respectable theory that partly what is driving the universe to expand is probably dark energy, and we don't really understand quite how that works. But there is a respectable theory that at some point expansion will stop and then gravity will become the dominant force. And that means that the universe will begin to contract again. And then we'll have a big crunch rather than a big bang. So there is a school of thought that is along the lines of what you're describing.
Well, thanks very much. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. I took a class from the management guru, Deming, one time, and one of his acolytes got up on the stage and talked about science in the West and the East. And one of the things he said was that science as we know it could only have grown up in the West and not in the East. And the reason being that in the East, they tend to think of things holistically. You're looking down on it. And Western mindset has been to take a look at the building blocks and take it individually until you build the house. I thought that was an interesting concept, and I still think there's something to be said in that. I think the problem today is that because building from the bottom up is hard, it's easier to take a holistic view and say, yep, that's a house, that's all I need to know. And I think the problem in America is that our education system and our cultural beliefs on a large part of the population, especially the Scot-Irish, who are mine, okay, take that, holistic view is very easy out of the Bible. What he told me, you don't need to think about it.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things that if you look around the world, the West, I agree, has been the dominant original scientific thinkers. The Islamic world, by the way, was more scientifically advanced until the 8th or 9th century when they ran into ideological problems, I think. But the West has been very innovative. Even though a big part of our population maybe focused on the conservative Christians, but not exclusively, are open to science. And we've had a huge R&D scientific establishment that has kept us doing that. And that is certainly threatened now. And to make a really overgeneralization, The East is not necessarily as good on original science, but they're certainly good at implementation, you know, and practical applications of theory. And that's what we're going to run into right now. We're running it into with chips, computer chips, where China is. We invented them, but they are implementing them and making them a lot less expensively. But interesting. All right, anything else? Okay, guys, thanks a lot.